Hello, and welcome to our webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Brian Kotler. I lead demand generation here at Intercom. And in today's webinar, we're going to be talking with a panel of world-class experts about your marketing tech stack, what should be in it, how to optimize it, how it should all work together, and hopefully we'll get a lot of really great insights from the folks we've got assembled here. A little bit of housekeeping before we jump in. We are going to be accepting questions through chat throughout the conversation. If you type it into the little chat bubble at the bottom, somehow magically it'll appear on this iPad, and we should be able to engage with your questions as we go through. So please feel free to do that. We'll also be recording, so don't worry if you miss anything or if you have a follow-up. We'll make sure that all this gets sent out to you, as well as all the follow-up materials. Lastly, just as an introduction, so this past December, we collaborated with the group here, and we released a big giant blog post talking about marketing tech stacks, how they should be organized, what should be in them, etc. And so what we want to talk about today is sort of walk through some of the structure of that post, get into some of the meaty topics and controversy that we sort of surfaced through its production, and hopefully everyone will be able to learn a lot. So now to jump in, I'd love to take a minute and do introductions. As I mentioned, I'm Brian. Maybe Harmony, you want to kick us off?
Thanks for having me, first of all. I'm Harmony Anderson. I am the Director of Demand Generation at Outreach.io. And Outreach is a sales engagement platform that's designed to accelerate revenue by enabling sales and marketing teams to personalize every interaction within the customer lifecycle. So it's a really powerful tool, and I certainly encourage you to check it out. But our demand gen strategy really has been in the past, demand gen was founded at Outreach about a year and a half ago to 2 years. So pretty new, pretty recent for a startup. And the strategy so far has been lay the foundation, start testing and optimizing programs just to get that kind of velocity of leads in. And moving forward, really, it's going to be to see growth, right? To bring on the programs that we need to optimize for revenue, to drive engagement with accounts, and just to keep scaling and get bigger as we go. So we're really in that growth phase right now, and so it's exciting to be here with this team and kind of hear what they're doing.
Thanks.
Cool. I'll keep it short and sweet. So I'm Kevin. I'm head of growth marketing at Segment. I work on a team that is mostly focused on like top of funnel acquisition type stuff, seeing everything through from awareness to acquisition to activation, and then kind of like handing it off to the other product and growth teams to take it from there, and sales teams as well. So yeah, that's quick, like what I'm focused on in terms of strategy, and that's like the context I'll be coming at this from.
Great, thank you.
I'll hand it over to Francis.
Awesome, thank you, Kevin. So I'm Francis Barrow. I'm the co-founder and CRO at MadKudu, and we're a customer decision platform and most well known for lead scoring and B2B SaaS with a lot of the folks here today. And I think on our the strategy on our side has been a lot around focusing more on the buyer journey rather than personas, and really trying to figure out what are some high quality pieces of content that we can produce, and how do we manage to push that around to target accounts or to people who we know are a good fit for the product, and managing to really have the highest hit with this high quality content. That's been the strong focus for us so far.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you could elaborate. In our prep, you mentioned that sort of your strategy is explicitly not to get lots of traffic. Maybe you could share a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've seen is that when you start opening maybe a little bit too quickly the funnel, it can be very distracting, because there's always people who are going to be interested in trying your product with something that's kind of a tangent to what you really want to be doing. And what we found is that it's a distraction for everyone, because then you start talking to engineering about doing this like little side project that might be interesting or not, and you start having to answer questions that are not necessarily the core questions that everyone has been focusing on. So it's just a lot of distractions, whereas by being really extremely focused on a small set of people, I mean, B2B SaaS is a relatively small space from a target market standpoint. We've been able to really figure out what are some of the major challenges that everyone has in there, and what is the buying journey for B2B SaaS. So it's really been helpful to be very targeted and be able to go very deep in some subjects. So we wrote a blog article around how long should your trial be? And that thing has been reshared by VCs like Thomas Tongus, who pushed it out a couple months ago. We had, I think, over, it was 20,000 views on LinkedIn. So it's been one, piece of content that's very specific to a question that marketers have in a specific space, has been tremendous for us to get our brand out, even though we were, a 5-person company at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been working well.
Great, thank you. And I guess a good transition. We have a team here in San Francisco. We're also coming to us from Chicago, right?
Yep.
So maybe Jacob, your intro as well. And it sounds like you have a very different approach than Francis. So it'd be great to hear about your approach as well.
Totally. So I'm Jacob Rudnick, head of content at G2 Crowd, so the business software and services review platform. Much different approach for us as we have thousands of products, hundreds of software categories on our site. So I think our content initiatives are much different in our goals. Ultimately, we want more traffic to those categories and to those products for a bunch of different purposes. But my team writes blog and related type of content that about the problems that those products and categories solve for marketers, for devs, for salespeople. So we're striking very broadly and trying to drive people or get people into our funnel and ultimately drive them down to the solutions that they may or may not know that they need. So we're producing a ton of content with the goal being a ton of traffic volume. So much different than that hyper-focused strategy, just way different.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you. I'm sure that'll come through as we talk about tech over the course of the conversation here. So I guess as a bit of setup, look, we all know tech is like a critical component and a requirement for a growing business today. It's how we differentiate. It's how we're able to go to market in a scalable way. How we're able to do more than just sort of what our teams are able to do in the hours they put in. At the same time, I mean, G2 Crowd alone, if we just go on there, like how many different categories of technology are there? How many open source versions and venture-backed versions and two-man little startups in Israel versions of every possible thing you can imagine are out there? And it makes it really hard to decide, where should you invest and how should you invest? So I guess to start, maybe we could talk a little bit about sort of the relationship between strategy and technology, and how to sort of think through that. What should come first and what's the relationship between the two? And maybe Harmony, you want to get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the most common way to start this is determining what your strategy is, what your objectives are, and then analyze your existing tech stack to see if that can solve the problem, solve the challenges that you're facing with your strategy. And I say existing because I think that we probably all have tech stacks or technology that we use where we only use certain features of them. And very rarely do we ever use like everything that the technology has to offer. So starting there, right? Talk to your partners. Like if you have a problem, can you solve it? Just expanding your partnership with the existing ones. And if not, then you would go out and look at the technology out there to see if you need to bring something new on. Then the second part of this would be, I think as marketers, it's our responsibility to always be educating ourselves on what's happening within the market and new technology that's coming out. So we were talking about this the other day, but I don't know what I don't know, right? So there could be startups coming out there that are solving incredible problems and can be a huge asset to your tech stack that you don't even know about. So I think that's the second part of this is, open those cold emails from the sales reps at these marketing tech companies. And I don't always respond, but I always want to make sure that I am completely up to date on what's going on. So not only making sure I have the existing tech stack that works, but I'm bringing on new things that are going to solve problems that I didn't actually knew that I had.
I feel like you're opening yourself up for like lots of people like hitting you up with like, hey, check this new technology out.
Yeah, that was a dangerous promise to make.
One thing I wanted to like add to that, and I think that the original article that like was a catalyst for this panel like does a great job of doing is kind of like chunking out the different pieces of your strategy around like acquisition or engagement or measurement for the three.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that like we also do at Segment for our strategy, which is kind of like map out all the different stages of the funnel and then look at the conversion rates and velocity through that different stage of the funnel so that like, oh, maybe my activation to retention rate is high and that velocity is normal. But like when it comes to acquisition to activation, that metric is low and slow or whatever. So like that's one area you can say like maybe there's technology that can help solve this problem or like a different approach to my strategy would be more effective.
Mm-hmm.
So like that's kind of like how we like try and look in like where to pinpoint of how to fill in the gaps of our marketing strategy, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Right, so Jacob, would you guys like to add anything?
Maybe it was just a question. I was wondering if you folks, I mean, especially on the side of like bigger companies or even that are just getting hammered by these outbound emails, like do you have a strategy around your marketing stack of like when to renew it, when to go look for something?
I mean, I think one of the things is you always need to be analyzing your existing tech stack. Like you should always kind of be auditing it, knowing what it's solving, knowing the processes and the operations behind it. And then when new things come up, you usually can like that light bulb will go off if you'll know like, is this going to help me or is it not? I think that's one of the things, just making sure you're always up to date and you're keeping at it.
I know for me, I think some of the benefit I get is from the team that I manage. We have sort of an interesting combination of cynics and optimists when it comes to tech. And some folks really just love new technology. They're on TechCrunch all the time. And so they're often the ones suggesting, oh, we should try this. Oh, I wonder if we could hook this to that. And then there's others, and frankly, I fall more on the cynical side, where I'm just like, is that really going to get the job done? Should we really spend that much money and use one feature inside of it? And I think that's like a natural good tension. So, you should, and if you're just an individual, I think you just kind of need to play both personas. Like, be willing to take risks and be an early adopter and challenge the assumptions of what you've already invested in. But then I personally would recommend being a little cynical, because every product marketing one-sheeter tells you it's going to solve all your problems. But then will you actually implement it correctly? Will you actually use it correctly? Will it actually screw up your data warehouse or not? And so on and so forth. So it's that balance that I think is tricky.
Right. And I think that the beauty of the world of B2B SaaS that we're in today is that it's very easy to run tests. So it's actually very easy to be cynical and be data driven and say, all right, a very standard example that everyone has to deal with is enrichment, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of enrichment providers out there. It is so simple to go and run a test. Like, I know that when we were working with Segment, they ran a ton of tests around that. It's really, it's super interesting because, as you said, everyone says, oh yeah, we hit 95% enrichment rates.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, sure, I don't believe you, but why not? Let's give it a try.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can actually run that test and see which product is the best for you. Because that's the other thing, is that, enrichment that works in one industry or one type of customer base might not work in another one. I think today we're fortunate to be able to test all these products and really get to see how much value they can potentially add to the marketing stack before we include them fully in our strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, one more thing to add here is that, like, since we were at Segment, like, it's so easy to like turn on all these new tools. It's like literally just like flipping a switch. Not that this is a pitch for Segment or anything, but one thing that we actually had to do, like, to evaluate this like tech stack that I inherited like a year ago, is that since GDPR hit on May 25th, it was like we had to go in and evaluate like all these different like vendors that we're using, because like we try to be pretty agnostic about the vendors and like test them all out. So like GDPR acted as like a forcing function for us to like go in and like clean up like our stack and make sure that like we have validated all these like data vendors and stuff. So I feel like that's a good like pitch point for GDPR, like being like, customer first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Well, sort of, Kevin, as you mentioned, we kind of have been, at least for the parts of the blog post, we've been talking about tech in the sense of things that help you acquire, things that help you engage, and things that help you measure. And so I thought maybe a good transition point to kind of dive into some of those categories and talk through maybe what we're using, what we're seeing out there. And I guess to start, Jacob, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you're getting more traffic and more leads. As you shared, G2 Crowd, the lifeblood of the business is traffic. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how your stack works there.
Totally. So again, just pure traffic, organic is the number one thing for my team right now. And as we built that, now it's turning that traffic into leads and improving our click-through rate. So it's evolved a bit. Our team's grown from 3 or 4 writers to 15 very quickly. So we moved from WordPress over to HubSpot. So there's more tools for just in platform for CTAs and capturing leads and things. But as far as the content strategy, like, the biggest thing for us is having an SEO tool so we can look at keywords, optimize content, track link backs, all that type of content related stuff. So we use right now Ahrefs for almost all of that type of stuff. Kind of falls with that last question, but it's getting to the point where it fits our team of 5 writers. We're struggling to make it fit 15. So evaluating more of enterprise level solutions that might fit thousands of pieces of content every quarter, where we were writing 100 or so before. And then as far as optimizing, tracking, like making sure we're hitting targets or looking for areas to improve, like we use Google Analytics. I don't think that's strange, but there's other products, but that's what we use. It's scaled well for us, but those are the 2 things. SEMrush is used by our SEO team for some other type of optimization. But that's those 3, HubSpot and Google Analytics and Ahrefs or maybe another SEO tool as we scale. That's like my core stack as far as content marketing.
Got it. Great. I guess to open it up, any sort of top of mind comments on those particular technologies? Let's be nice. Or anything you want to share about way that you guys are acquiring technology?
I mean, I'm a big fan of all those tools like SEMrush, Ahrefs, Google Analytics. Like we use all that stuff. Or it's not so much me as like we have a person that does all that kind of stuff. He's like the SEO guru. So, but yeah, I mean, those are all great tools. I'd recommend them all or try them out.
The only comment I would say is I've never encountered a Google Analytics instance that was actually working right out of the gate whenever I've like gone to help a friend or entered a new job or new role. So just as a word of caution to anybody out there, do not trust your GA unless you've validated your GA.
Especially with bots, the bots are just like such a disaster on Google Analytics. It's like, sometimes you'll see your traffic just like spike like crazy, and you're like, "What is that?" And it's like, "Oh, it's a bot." And it's like filtering out that traffic is somewhat challenging.
Yeah. I thought I was doing a great job one quarter, and it turned out like all that growth was on our terms and conditions page because of a bot. I'm like, man, I really got to clean this thing up. So anyway, sorry, that's my own pain. I guess okay. So we talked about how we get the traffic, we acquire leads. Now maybe we could talk about how you engage them. So maybe Harmony, you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So the leads are on your website. The biggest thing for us that I want everyone to think about is speed to lead, right? Time to touch. So how quickly can you actually get personal message or personally engage with the leads or the users on your website? So one of the first things that comes to mind is a live chat solution, like Intercom. You're right there, whether or not it's a bot interacting with your users or it's an actual person who, a sales rep who has the information on the user who's visiting your site and reaching out to them personally and to try to engage them. Or send them more content or anything, right? The longer they're on your site, the longer they're engaging with you, the more likely they are to probably have a lead. So that's one of the first things. And then, of course, there's solutions like progressive profiling where you can make sure and shorten your forms for people who are coming back, which we use MadKudu to do. Or the lead scoring on your website or pulling in the G2 crowd intent data. So there's a lot you can do to make sure you have a lot of information about your users and that you're using it. You're enabling your sales and marketing team to then engage right there, right when they're on your site.
Great. Kevin Francis, anything?
Maybe on that one thing is I'm very passionate about this subject because I think that in today's world, I mean, we've kind of screwed up on the marketing side of like creating these massive forms where we're essentially asking highly qualified leads to come and qualify themselves by saying how big of a company they are, what kind of role they're in. So we make an experience, like if we go back to the buyer journey is terrible because we're just trying to separate the good leads from the bad leads. So you're a good lead and you're paying the price of coming along with bad leads. So I think, figure out how we make it frictionless, how we quickly get to, having the lead get whatever, answer they need. And sometimes it's just more time on the website. And I think that's where we tend to, hit leads with a giant hammer by, constantly pushing bots or constantly pushing for demos when people are not necessarily ready. And I think there's a lot of testing that comes into play of saying when people are on this page, when they've gone through this kind of process, what is most likely the next thing that they want to do on your website? And it could be talking to a human to make sure that they can fully understand how they can test your product and how to get value from it. But it's not necessarily always that. I think that's where I get a little bit frustrated when there's like marketing that's very dogmatic with the on one example of saying, oh, no forms, this should only be chats. No, maybe not. We should never be dogmatic, whatever we do. And I think that's one thing where it's about how do you make the process frictionless for the myriad of customers that you have. And every single prospect is different. And that means inherently it's very complicated to make it frictionless for everyone. But that's why it's exciting to be in marketing ops today.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that one of the principles we try to follow, and I emphasize try because it's not actually doable, but it's like we think if you can know something, you should know something. Yeah. And so that means you need to collect data, you need to use it in the right context, and then you also acknowledge that it fails most of the time. And so you have that balance. You're trying to use the context to give the best possible journey, and then you're trying to give people ways that they can kind of navigate for themselves. But you're right, like some sort of dogmatic statement like never have a forum. That's kind of crazy because what if somebody has JavaScript turned off and the bot doesn't fire, or only use bots? Well, what if your bot doesn't have all the rules programmed for that particular journey? Like you need to be thoughtful about how you apply the tech to enable the buyer to go through their own process and their own path.
And that's where using data is so valuable, right?
Mhm.
Because you can usually identify like the company they're coming from with IP lookup data. You can identify if they're already in your existing database, right? And you can create those different tracks given the data that you have in your system. So just don't be shy using data to create all of this.
But be GDPR compliant.
But be compliant.
I only collect first-party data.
All right, I think I had a question come through, so please do keep sending them in. As I again look at the magic screen here. Oh, gotta log in. Forgive me, I should have done that first. All right, one really great question came through about. We mentioned how you have to figure out. I think Kevin, you were saying how you have to sort of think through your stack, think through your data, look for your problems to then determine where you're going to apply tech. And there's sort of a question of like, what's the process for that? Do you have a big giant flow chart? Do you use a whiteboard? Are you making lucid charts all the time? Like, how do you sort of go through the process of documenting what you've got and where you're going to focus?
Yeah, so this kind of like goes back to the work or the way that we think about it. At least that segment is like the work that Brian Balfour and like the Reforge team has like built out this model for like a growth loop or a growth process where you're measuring different parts within the funnel, like you're defining an aha moment or a retention moment, an activation moment, and all this kind of stuff. So you can like track like the different areas where people are going throughout the funnel, and then that kind of like directs your strategy. So I would say like probably like cohort analysis is probably the best way to do all that stuff. So like this cohort of users retained, and then like you can look back to see like when they activated, how they activated, all this kind of stuff. So I don't have like all the answers right now. It's like a whole entire course of like how to like learn that stuff. So I would like highly recommend the Reforge class, which I haven't even taken, but like I know people in segment that have, and they've like kind of educated me about that. But like definitely check out some of his like stuff. It's really great and like gives you a good starting point for like how to tackle that kind of stuff.
Okay, great. Anything to add? Because a couple more questions came through. All right, cool. Question that came in from Morgan. Thank you, Morgan, wherever you are. How do you balance a tool's feature set? So what the tool can do with the user experience for your team, which I know like Salesforce is the classic example of this. It's incredibly powerful, but if you don't really curate the views, super challenging and burdensome on your teams to work inside of. So how do you balance the power of a tool with the efficiency of using it? And with so many tools doing similar stuff, how do you make a decision about when to jump from one tool to the next? Yeah, go ahead, Harmony. Yeah.
That's a really tough question, honestly, because that's kind of what I mentioned earlier of like these solutions are incredibly robust. All of them are. And usually you're only using, 1 to 2, maybe 3 features out of 10 potentially. And so I think make sure you have a sole owner of this technology who's like that super power user of it and who's a really good relationship with your partner, because they're going to be the ones that are saying, oh, well, we have this new feature that's coming out, or this new one we already have that you're not using that could actually solve the problems. Like, be incredibly open with your partners. Like, usually what I'll start with is going to that power user, making sure they're on this meeting, talking to my partners and asking like, look, this is the new objective we have, or this is the new process or goal that we're trying to solve. Like, what do you have that can help us do that before actually going out and talking to other people? And I think the tech, the user experience, and what it's actually offering is just, it's a balance, right? And I would always err to the side of caution of not just of trying to keep your tech somewhat consolidated. I know that's a little bit, tough for people, but keep it a little bit consolidated because it's going to be easier for you to manage long term versus, 3 versus 10 pieces of technology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one other thing on that topic too is like trying to listen to people that are your like go-to-market teams that are actually interfacing with all of these tools is something that I've had to like learn over time, where I'm like, when you first start in demand generation or growth, or whatever, just like firing off all these different features and like overloading people with too much stuff, and they're like, oh, I can't make sense of it all, like there's too much noise. But one thing that like we've tried to do is listen to our SDR teams, our customer service teams, and like hear what their problems are, and then we can figure out how the technology or the features can like fill those problems, whether it's like alerting or monitoring or something like that.
Got it.
Maybe one thing there, and like G2 Crowd is probably a good place to go and first off, like just educate yourself a little bit more as to what people that are at a similar stage, similar space think about those tools, because what can be powerful for, a giant organization is probably not as powerful for a small organization if you need to have 5 admins to handle the system. I think one of the important elements also is to stay very focused on the need at hand, because SaaS vendors are very good at selling you what is going to be your need when you hit that next milestone in growth. But to be able to hit that milestone, first you need to grow today. I think making sure that you pick the solution that's the best fit for your goal today, for your team today, is really important. And there's some anecdotal things on that. So we were talking about this with Harmony just before, but when you're deciding what solution to go for, it's also important to understand what is the local ecosystem of experts who can help you with it. So we were talking about the Marketo versus Pardot kind of conundrum. I've heard this question from CMOs almost like every dinner. People like, oh, I'm thinking Marketo, Pardot, and I'm not sure. And one of the things that Harmony mentioned that I never really realized before was that the local ecosystem of admins that are excellent in Marketo versus excellent in Pardot is actually strongly localized. So Bay Area is more Marketo and East Coast is more Pardot. And I think that's something to take into account when you're thinking of building your team, because you want to have in the team someone who's very strong in the product that you end up using.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if you have nobody to drive the car, what's the point of having it?
Right.
Jacob, a question just came through, but before we jump to it, I'd love to get you specifically mentioned that your team is kind of struggling and hitting the limits of Ahrefs. Great piece of software, but you're getting to that point. So what was the breaking point for you to say, this is we've been very happy with our journey, but it's time to go look at the next thing? Because I think it might help get at Morgan's question about how do you know when it's time?
Totally. For us right now, it's some automation on the reporting. There's only a certain amount of manual reports I can run weekly. With 3 writers, again, it's not a big deal to spend 20 minutes running those reports or building them out manually. But there was just a certain point where I was spending 2-3 hours a week doing this reporting and making sure the data was right. And there was no way to automate it. I tried to work with their support and see if they had something. It wasn't in their roadmap. I think we'll still use it to step halfway back. We've gotten crazy adoption from our team. My only suggestion for that is have your really heavy adopters build out documentation or work with someone to build that out. We had low adoption of Ahrefs for a year basically, and had 3 people that used it all day long, but never transferred that knowledge. And once we built out documentation and trained people and got the buy-in, we have a team of 15 people who are really well versed with it. So to step backwards, but now we just can't automate enough, and it's not scaling with us. So that's our biggest problem. My biggest concern moving to something else is we have people that are onboarded and really, really functional and really good at Ahrefs. And I don't know how that's going to go moving into an enterprise tool that nobody's used or one person's used before. So that's scary to me. And that's a hesitation of why we've bootstrapped it and put Band-Aids all over this thing and try to make it work for us.
Which matches a lot to the point about the hiring pool. Is you're nervous to change because you have a team that's ramped and you're afraid of the productivity loss by changing. Same thing if you're in a Marketo-oriented town and you choose to be a HubSpot shop. Good luck finding an admin to run it for you. So the people side of the tech stack seems like a theme that probably is underappreciated as people kind of go through assembling all their technologies together. Great. So I think that's playing off your point about analytics. Probably a good transition point to talk a bit about sort of the measurement portion of the stack. I don't know, Kevin, if you wanted to open, I know you had a few thoughts on it, but we can open it up to the whole group, is sort of, how do you think about sort of the analysis and optimization portion of the technology that you need?
Yeah, so on the analysis side of things, analysis and optimization side of things, I'm really just trying to look at 2 specific things. One is what actions are meaningful that people are taking, that are top users, our top customers are taking throughout their customer journey, and then who are the people that we're targeting, or who are the people that we want to take those actions. And it kind of also goes back to a little bit of retention analysis, where you're looking at the number of people who are your best customers, and then going in and seeing trying to pattern match as to what those people are trying to accomplish, what their profile looks like, using enrichment tools to see maybe they're an e-commerce person, or they're at an e-commerce industry, and that they are a product manager, and that's your core user, and then trying to figure out and solve what those problems are. So you can look at it from the data analysis side of things, or you can look at it quantitatively, where you find those top users and actually interview them. I think that's there's a lot of value in doing the qualitative analysis of that. So like going back to like the strategy side of it, like how do you optimize? So it's like you find your audience, you find like what actions they're trying to take or what problems they're trying to solve, and then just go out there and try and speak to those problems and find more people like them is kind of like our approach to acquisition, at least that segment.
Great. Sorry for the beeps. It's all the great questions coming through. I guess I don't know. Would anyone like to add anything in terms as far as the analytics and optimization portion goes?
Sure. Maybe one thing on that is, I mean, yeah, I abide by the rule, like very consultant framework of measure, predict, optimize. So everything starts with measuring. I've already heard a couple of times mentioned the importance of the quality of data, because if you have the wrong data, then there's nothing you can do with it. I feel like that's a topic that's underappreciated in the sense of not just there's bad data, there's garbage data. That's one thing. It's obvious that you don't want to have garbage data, but there's another point of when we were talking about high volumes of traffic. So there's this pretty famous paradox in statistics called the Simpson Paradox, which is if you look at a statistic at an aggregate, you might end up with a conclusion that's different from looking at it at any level of granularity. And so a very simple example is saying, let's say you have good leads and bad leads. And when you look at it on average, your good leads actually convert worse than your bad leads. Super surprising if you, well, then we probably have it wrongly classified. But then when you look at it by lead source, in every single instance, your good leads perform better than the bad leads. But the thing is that your good leads are all coming from product signups, which on average convert at an abysmal conversion rate, whereas the bad leads are coming from demo requests, which on average convert higher. And so the average of the bad leads is the average of demo requests, which is higher than product signups. And so what you end up doing is you can be looking at the wrong problem and you're trying to optimize something that's not the right problem to optimize for. And this happens a lot when you start having high volumes of traffic and you realize, oh, well, you know, this lead source is not converting or this ad is not converting. And so one of the things we did with Segment, actually I think like a year and a half ago, is we started saying, well, what if we tried to have some form of, you know, classification of the quality of the traffic that's coming from each of these lead sources? And now we look at the performance of each by the quality they're bringing in. And there was a much stronger correlation in ROI than there was in just volume. And I think that's one of the things where today there's still a lot of people that are driven by volume instead of quality because it's harder to measure. But this can lead to, you know, the absolute wrong decision and you're not going to be able to optimize your process. So I think there's one of the things that we look a lot into is how do you segment your analyses? How do you segment your data up to the point where you know there's going to be a meaningful insight that you can gather from it. Sorry, I didn't mean to steal it.
Mm-hmm.
My mind is blown by the Simpson Paradox right now.
Yeah, I'm gonna Google that later.
Yeah, it's a good point, and like it's I also wanted to like give MadKudu a little plug because like it's so like imperative to how we like score people and where we like route them. So it just simplifies things in terms of like we don't have to like think about like did they do all these different types of actions that like score them and like calculate all that like calibration on the scoring model of things. It's just kind of like, is this a good lead or a bad lead? And if it's a good lead, like what route do we want them to take? If it's a bad lead, like maybe we don't want to talk to them anymore, or maybe we want to just like educate them so that when they like do transition to a company that's like a company that would be a good fit, they become a good lead and like they're fans of Segment or us or whatever. So
Yeah, and one more thing to add in is multi-channel attribution and those solutions honestly have changed my life. And before I joined Outreach, was kind of hacking my attribution models. And now, just to name drop, we use Visible. And I don't know how I've lived without it, honestly, to do revenue attribution. So we use their W-shaped model. And it's completely ingrained into our business now. So we can see down to the asset what is converting into revenue, channels, by partner, by spend, all of that. And I think having a solution like that is incredibly helpful because there are things you cannot see by just looking at first touch, last touch, or just, you know, general campaign attribution in Salesforce. And so that's one thing that I value so much that I just didn't realize I needed until I had it.
Mm-hmm. No, I think attribution is probably, we don't talk about it enough because an incorrect attribution model or just a misinterpretation can wildly change the way you allocate your budget and your headcount and all these things, and do it for potentially the wrong reasons or with the wrong signals. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess, I have a bunch of questions we'll get to, I promise. I did want to ask a question about, we're talking a lot about, and I think in particular this comes up when you start to get into the data question, which is how do we make all this stuff work together nicely? If you've got 7, 8 different data inputs from all these different systems, everything claims it's your system of record, but very little actually is. So I don't know, maybe Francis, you want to share a little bit about how you think about getting all these things to play nicely and scale?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, it's an architecture problem. I think it's fundamentally, I think there's been a big shift that operated in marketing where, in the 60s, I feel like marketing was seen as the like kind of Mad Men. It was all about branding. And then early 2000s or potentially 2010 was when, demand gen started growing. And now we have all these channels that we can go and, acquire customers through. And I think now we're in this this new era, which is really marketing ops. It's about how do you leverage all this data that's available in a meaningful manner to, increase the ROI of your marketing programs. And so I really think that, it's a pivotal question for any company to figure out how do you build a marketing ops architecture that works well together. And you're right, like everyone says they do, but they actually don't. I'll plug in Segment. We've been using Segment from the start. It was the first integration that we built at MadKudu because we fundamentally believed in the idea that you should have at least one very easy way to pipe data across all your different elements. So first off, we will never use a product that doesn't have API, and most likely we won't use a product that doesn't integrate with Segment, because if you don't have that conduit, it's going to be really hard to push data. We're going to have to build custom integrations, and our engineers should be focusing on the product, not on marketing ops. And the second element is you need a strong data store for, a strong data store. On our side, again, like we use kind of our own product, but also Segment where we pipe everything into a Redshift data warehouse, and then from there we export the data back into Salesforce and to what have you. But all of that happens in this kind of customer data platform that we have in the center, and I think it's really essential to have a clear structure where you have something in the center where everything plugs into. You do identity resolution and you understand really the 360-degree profile of your customers, and then have API connections with all of your execution engines. I think if you don't have that, you are generating silos, and it makes it really, really hard to scale.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. I agree. I think we probably don't do enough architecture design. Our colleagues in product organizations, they spend half their time thinking about those questions. And I show our systems diagrams to our CTO, and he damn near vomits when he sees it, because it's just like there's no way it would survive the scrutiny of a product engineer. It's just like we operate at different standards and probably don't spend enough time trying to clean up the way that data is piped and passed and deduplicated.
Yeah, one thing I'll just add to that too is like the importance of getting bi-directional data from the different platforms that you're using or different tools that you're using. And like one nightmarish scenario could happen where someone's submitting a support ticket through Intercom or something like that. And they're like, your product's down, it's buggy or whatever, and then like your marketing team doesn't know that communication is happening, so it's not tracked. So then they send out like or your even worse, like your payment team sends out a notification like, hey, pay us for this feature that you're using, when they're like, oh, the feature's down, like why would I want to pay you? It's like a terrible customer experience. So that's kind of like the importance of like having this holistic view of the customer, like illustrated in an example.
Got it. Anything else that I have a couple questions I'd love to raise. All right, cool. So these are kind of a potpourri of questions. So we'll jump around a little bit. Jacob, I think you'll have an opinion on this one, but if not, feel free to pass, and we'll give somebody else the hot potato here. One of the questions, and I know I've struggled with this, is GA as a tool, which I think is probably one of the most ubiquitous things in everyone's stack, has these very generic buckets of just like direct, this mysterious direct thing that we're supposed to work with. Just curious from the team, I'm thinking maybe Jacob, you might have an opinion, but would love to hear others as well. Like, how do you go about sort of managing that, kind of try and break it apart so you can optimize and execute better when such a huge percentage of your traffic is mysterious?
Yeah, that problem's certainly not unique. I'm kind of smiling because I don't always know that. From a content side, for me, like, I've been at G2 for 3.5 years. I know the content that's been written for the most part, and like have a good idea. A lot of times I can reverse engineer where things are coming from, or like kind of, I don't know, we piece together all of our, Google Analytics, or we have HubSpot data, we have Ahrefs, and we kind of can tell. I don't have a good solution, honestly. I'm trying to think of the answer. It's a problem I deal with.
We might have lost you, but all
I'm
right.
glad that the expert doesn't have an answer either, because like, this is something that's like
But-
so like just drives me insane. So I was like hoping that there was going to be an answer that was like a great answer for like solving direct traffic, but
Mhm.
it's frustrating for sure.
Yeah, I think we've done some like kind of correlative stuff with like brand work and events and things like that. But yeah, frankly, I've never gotten to the bottom of it.
And your finance team is like, you know, where's the ROI and all this like spend that you're doing? And it's like, well, it's all kind of like a big like floating like a rising tide floats like all boats. Or
Well,
whatever.
I think that's a fair point for what is for a moment of digression. I think it's a fair point. It's like we tend to really heavily try and optimize the channels we can measure. And then we don't spend enough time looking sort of at a program wide level. Like what's the cost per lead? Forget paid or not. Let's just look at the cost per lead overall. Let's look at the cost per customer overall and things like that. It's tricky because you really do want to hold your performance teams accountable to spending their money well and things like that. But realistically, we know that there's this direct thing, there's brand, that there's, the attribution model can't account for every action people are taking on and offline.
Yeah.
Like, how do you account for the fact that a salesperson called on them and didn't put it in Salesforce?
Yeah.
But it matters. So yeah, I do think it's a very fair point not to over-index too hard on trying to be able to quantitatively maximize every single dollar you spend in that specific way.
Well, and branding obviously is so important for marketers, and that's one of those things that's so incredibly difficult to track. So usually when I have leadership or anyone comes to me and is like, where is this direct traffic coming from? It's usually like, well, we had this great event, or we attended this, or it's branding, or something amazing happened, or we had an announcement, or PR. Like there's so many explanations, but you still can't directly pinpoint what that is. And yeah, like these guys are saying, I wish I had a fancy answer to help with that. I don't.
But I think so. There are a couple like hints to solutions that are coming up. I think what the folks at GD Crowd are doing in partnership with Clearbit Reveal, I think is interesting because it goes back to the idea if you have this centralized database where let's imagine a perfect world where all the data for any marketing event gets logged into whatever system and it all falls into that, right? So now, if we think of it, one of the things that also has to happen as a shift is that we think more of B2B as selling to accounts and less selling to leads. I think, if someone from a company comes to an event and then you see traffic coming from that company to the website, not saying it's direct correlation, but you can start inferring that it might be. And I think that's something that's happening that, I know, again, Segment is doing with the anonymous, it's kind of the other way around where you're saying someone is anonymous on your website. Once they get identified, we can track them back. And then potentially, the salesperson can ask them, well, how did you hear about us or what led you to come to the website? And this is something that we do. We track it in Salesforce. Like every single demo call we have, we ask how did they hear about us? Because what we've come to find is that 95% of people who come to our website just come to the website to convert. They don't do any research on our website. They just hear about us through like partners or people talking at events. And I think that's the truth of marketing today, is that because everyone is selling the same pipe dream, like no one believes what's on the website. We were talking about this when we were talking about how do you pick your marketing stack. And so essentially what you end up doing is you start having these trusted kind of advisors that are talking and giving hints as to what they're using. And this is where you really get your information from. And I think that's really the source of a lot of that traffic. And it's just incredibly hard to go and backtrack unless you're asking people, or if you're tracking at the account level, you might be able to know that it's someone from an account that has been worked because they were a target account.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really great point. And I would say that question, if your SDRs or MDRs aren't asking, how did you hear about us? Make sure and add that in as one of the first questions. We did that at one of my previous companies, and we learned that 30% of everyone coming directly had heard of us through a niche podcast we were advertising on. That they weren't going to that dedicated landing page we created, of course. They were but that's where they heard of us. And so, and you can do attribution that way. It's incredibly helpful. So really good point.
Yeah, to Kevin's point earlier, the qualitative is critical. You need the qualitative to round out the picture for everything that you can't quite see in your GA, or you're not going to be able to see with your Clearbit Reveal loop or whatever the case may be. All right, another question, to get management consulting here for a second. One of the questions coming through is, so how do you balance the productivity loss when you move between pieces of technology with the scale benefit that you get by having done so? And so like I always talk to my team about change management. The tool we use that we implement properly is better than the cool one we have but don't actually use. And so I would just love to hear a little bit, like, for your teams, when it's time to buy a new piece of tech, how do you manage the transition, and how do you make sure that like folks are actually going to use it right? Do you actually use the service hours that they force you to buy when you buy the new tech? Do you bring in a third-party consultant or a trusted advisor? How do you guys think about this?
Oh, do I have to answer? I was gonna suggest Jacob answers it because he's got people to adopt Ahrefs, and like because that seems like like you're bringing in this new thing and you gotta have people to like start adopting this tool. So I don't know, Jacob, can you answer?
Yeah. I mean, I think that was a story of like us not doing well and then turning it around. And again, it was getting me and 2 or 3 other people to really adopt it. Like we had a single heavy user that understood it, that used it before, got us in a room like at 5 o'clock with a beer and like showed us all the things, like showed us the possibilities. And we knew the goals of why we were using it. We understood that we needed to drive more organic traffic, needed to get more links, like did some analyzing of our website, of other websites, and then like kind of let us run. From there, when we tried to roll it out and just did the same thing, it didn't work to scale to 15 people. But again, that was where we built that documentation, had, showed a lot of hands-on showing people and then giving them the results. And I think that worked well. Again, from moving to an even bigger product with no adopters or no users right now, we've got a really good project management person, someone who's very good at documentation and has done the implementation before. And so having him involved and working with the change management type stuff, it's not my forte at all, but I'm supposed to be one of these heavy users. So working with him to build out things for our whole team so they'll adopt, like he's going to be instrumental. It's just having someone who's done it before and knows those type of things.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I would add, oh, please go ahead.
Oh, I thought of a quick win that we're rolling out a content management system over the course of the last couple of months. Contentful, which is a great platform. And I think it's important to show like quick wins where, we kind of like rolled out this big piece of technology to our marketing team. We're like, look, you're like all enabled to like build your own web pages and do your own things. And people are just like, looking through this whole platform. They're like, there's so much here. It's like just learning like how to use like WordPress or something like new like that. But some people like actually took to it and because they had like an objective to like launch a landing page or like, help themselves out. So like by doing that and taking that action and like showing that like, yes, it can be done. Like, and yes, it was like easy. Like once you get the hang of it, it's like, it's just important to show those quick wins so that people like other people within the org are like, oh, I want to do that same thing too. And then they can adopt it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The only thing I would add is I think like learning to use technology is work. And so I think it's important to like acknowledge and create time and space for the team, like those new users, to like don't assume they're going to make a landing page the day after the CMS rolls out. Give them some time to learn and practice and prototype and even require that they do so, because I think it's very easy. Again, it goes to the documentation. Everything is super easy to use apparently, but then it still takes 6 months to get adopted properly and actually used properly. So just acknowledging that is actually work, and you have to create that space for the folks to go through that process, I think is really important.
That time.
Make sure you have that one owner, the dedicated owner, before you sign that contract, and they know that this is part of their role, because that's going to be incredibly helpful.
Great. Oh, go ahead, Jacob. Did you have one more?
Yeah, the final thing just with that one project manager or the owner is setting deadlines for other people, because if it's not like a need to do, if it's not a requirement or they don't have that deadline, they'll always put it off because it's something new and it's changing for them. And like just giving me a deadline to have this done, like to have this implemented or to try this, like it forces me to put it on my calendar, it forces me to put it in Asana, like it just makes me do it. And having that where like even if it'll be uncomfortable, giving a deadline is huge.
Great. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left. I would say to the audience, feel free to send in any more questions. I'll try and kind of rapid fire hit on all things. You want a recommendation for a data vendor? Just ask, whatever, we'll try. In the interim, while folks do that, I thought we might finish up with predictions. So we could talk a little bit about what everyone is seeing and what you sort of anticipate is coming down the road in the new year from MarTech. Maybe we can go in this direction out to Chicago.
Sure.
All right.
Sure. I guess the first one I have is that MarTech is not going to consolidate. I think there's an overall trend for expansion of the marketing tech landscape. There might be consolidation in some specific spaces, but I think overall there's such a tremendous expansion that is just going to keep on going. And because the cost of creating software is so small, we're going to have more and more best-in-class software built for potential niches, and it's going to be very hard to justify, if you're in that niche, not buying the product that is specifically designed for you, and rather going with big beast that's the famous name. So I think I'm not a believer in consolidation in the years to come, even though we are at the end of the like infamous 7-year cycle where we should be seeing consolidation. I definitely think that if there is a downturn in the economy, we're going to see a lot of startups have a hard time, but it's just going to explode again right afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is kind of like a hard question of like, where do you see things going? Like there's 7,000, companies in that messiness of the MarTech stack where it's like, just like, you don't even like look at that thing anymore because like that was like a ton of like marketing tech companies out there. But I mean, I do feel like there will be like some consolidation where like Salesforce or Marketo or like these big monoliths will like try and like by way of like creating features. But that's like not going to slow down like all the other like small startups that have like cheap accessibility to like servers and like AWS and like all this kind of stuff. It's like giving it different like more and more innovation and like, and also to that point, like I feel like there's never a time or never a day or week that goes by where I'm like, man, I wish this marketing tool did like this cool new feature, or like did this cool thing, or like this tool would be so much better, like or like why is this stupid tool not working this way that I want it to, right? So like that just like paves the way for more and more innovation and people like fill in those like gaps. So yeah, I don't know. I wish there was like one single solution where just like AI takes over and just like does all the things and like my job's done here. But it doesn't really work like that, I guess.
Unfortunately not.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm not even gonna get to the AI because I think that's like coming, but still down the road. I think you have to think about, again, goes back to strategy and what the goals are for your organization. But one of the things that is on top of my mind is like ABM. No one really knows what ABM is or how to do it really, really well. And there are just hundreds of technologies that say they do ABM. So that's one example of like, there's going to be stuff coming out all the time. They're all going to have a different purpose that's leading up to one objective, and get what's best for your organization, right? And listen to your peers and how they're using, and keep your eyes and ears open, because you never know that there's new technology that's up, brand new, that solve a massive problem for you. And so I would just say, stay, educate yourself, always do your research, listen to industry peers, read content, and just, forward with the.
Great. Jacob?
Yeah, I think that a couple of them mentioned AI, and I don't think it's like going to take over or change anything drastically, but I think you'll see these incremental changes where your tools get a little bit smarter and can help like the time you spend in them be more useful. Like even Google Analytics having insights that actually tell me something for the first time, just on that home screen, like that can point me in the right direction when I'm using it for that 30 minutes a day. And so just those little bits of AI that are getting better and more refined, I think we'll see more of that going forward, and it'll be in more of the things that we do.
Great, thank you. All right, we're going to close with super rapid fire to close. Last question from the audience here. So you have to promise not to be too verbose. Just I'm going to point, and you're going to say the two pieces of technology you're most excited to be using in the new year. Harmony?
ABM tech.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't decided which direction I'm going to go there, but I know we're going to bring on a partner to help us with that, and so I'm incredibly excited about that.
Cool. Kevin?
Yeah, actually, we're using starting out with some ABM stuff right now using Listen Loop. So that's interesting. They just got acquired actually, so that's will be something that will be weird to like follow through with. But yeah, that and then like a multi-touch attribution type of tool. Maybe we'll look into Visible since that was recommended. It's Visible, right? Yeah, so many names. Yeah, so that's always like a tough challenge to solve. So I feel like that's a good technology I'm looking forward to.
Totally. Francis?
Probably G2 Crowd and Livestorm.
Livestorm, I don't know it.
Livestorm, they do their webinar software. Very cool. They fully integrate with segments so that any event that happens on the webinar is tracked as a segment event. So just like it feeds nicely into like the whole thing I was saying about like having that pipe directly into the warehouse.
Great. And Jacob?
Yeah, I know our marketing team as a whole is looking into more ABM and scaling that and refining that. For me, it's like this scalable SEO, but also like content analysis as we have more and more data, more like again 1,000 pieces every quarter, being able to hone in and get more data from there. So we're looking at tools to scale that and understand that better.
Fantastic. And I guess for my part, looking a lot at attribution, visible certainly in our vendor list, but we'll be looking at a few others and as a CMS as well. It's like I think this is going to be a blocking and tackling quarter or two while we get some of those foundational pieces in place. Well, great. Thank you all so much. I know I learned a lot from this conversation. I know from the questions the audience did as well. So thank you for taking the time. For those that haven't had a chance, go check out the blog post. It has more wisdom from this whole group. And we'll be sending out the recording and further materials. So feel free to check those out and ask any questions of us that you may have. So thank you all again.
Thanks, guys.
All right, thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.